Hello everyone, Dr. Philip Travis here. And this week in our exploration of a history of modern Russia, we're going to look at the October Revolution. Though we're going to look at much more than just the October Revolution, of course, October of 1917. This revolution, of course, was set in the context, the greater context of the deep systemic issues associated with the history of the Tsarist Russian Empire, as well as the more short-term issues associated with the First World War. And this moment in time, of course, has fundamental long-term historical ramifications for the modern world, and certainly for modern Russia and the states that particularly most directly surround it, though, of course, much more broadly than that as well. For this week, we're going to begin, those of us who are my history students, we're going to begin our extra credit activity. And in this extra credit activity, all I want you to do, sometimes for the extra credit activity, I have students state a specific factoid. For this extra credit opportunity, I want you to summarize what you think are some of the key points in this announcement. And there's an extra credit discussion forum. You'll see where you can summarize that. Remember also, if you're watching this as a student of mine in history, remember for our discussion forums, make sure that you follow the directions. The directions sometimes confuses folks a little bit because the due date, the final due date for discussions is the very end of the week, Sunday of the end of the week. However, for full credit, of course, I want to see folks beginning their activity in the discussion forum by the end of the day on Thursday. And likewise, in conjunction with that, I want to see the factoid post by the end of the day on Thursday. Why is that? The reason that is because for the discussion forum, it's supposed to be interactive. So the idea is that you will be going in there, making a post or a reply. Remember, make sure they're substantial in nature, engaging the material in a meaningful way. But the idea is that there's an interaction. So if everyone just goes in on Sunday, midday, and does a post and does a bunch of replies, it's hard to see how there could be a reaction there in the week assigned. If you start by Thursday at the latest, and then you come back on Friday or Saturday, then we could probably foster greater interaction. That's why we do it that way. And of course, it's okay to post on Tuesday and reply twice on Thursday. You don't have to start by Thursday. You can start anytime during the week before midnight on Thursday for full credit. Unless I state otherwise, one post, two replies, starting by Thursday, with a total of 2 separate days of activity. And the extra credit, the reason I want to see that by Thursday is because that's the whole idea, is that folks are getting into the class, thinking about it, looking at the reading, engaging the material earlier in the week, because that's going to be the practice that's going to best kind of facilitate our learning and understanding of this. Okay. So to the context of what we're looking at here, the context of our subject for this week, the October Revolution. So, first of all, the October Revolution, which is the Bolshevik Revolution, this is actually really the second revolution of the so-called Russian Revolution of 1917. The first came with the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. So, if you will, the removal of the last Romanov Tsar, Tsar Nicholas, which occurred in the beginning of 1917. And here, these are Russian soldiers protesting in the spring, early March of 1917. Here you see Russian soldiers in a World War I trench on the Eastern Front. The collapse of the Romanov Tsars really came in the context of an extensive level of hardship for the people, workers, farmers, soldiers, and so on in the context of the First World War. The First World War, of course, began at the beginning of August 1914. about a month after the assassination of the Archduke to the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28th, 1914. By the time the war has carried through for a couple of years, it became a war of attrition, as I'm sure many of you know. And this brought a great deal of hardship to Russia. Prices of goods were high. There was want of food. Morale for soldiers was very poor. There was a great deal of economic hardship in Russia, in cities like, of course, Petrograd, St. Petersburg. And there were actually fairly widespread mutinies of soldiers during this time period, as the hardship of the war had really begun to take its toll. This ultimately led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas. And for the rest of 1917, until the Bolshevik Revolution of October, Tsar Nicholas was effectively under house arrest in the east of the country, and the government was run largely by Kerensky, who is this individual right here, who was a pretty here with his cabinet, if you will. Kerensky was a pretty well known, visible figure in Russia at the time. But of course, Kerensky's leadership proved to be much more difficult and problematic than he or anyone else may have expected at the time. And eventually this gives rise to the rise of Lenin in the successful Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And of course, this revolution was launched from Petrograd, from St. Petersburg. Interestingly, of course, Lenin, some interesting, kind of facts about Lenin. Lenin, of course, was in exile during the First World War. He was in Switzerland. He had a long history of being an anti-government sort of radical in the Russian Empire. And Lenin was actually, his movement back to the areas around St. Petersburg was actually facilitated in part by Germany, who hoped that Lenin might, in fact, sow the seeds of revolution that might take Russia out of the war. Interestingly, that's precisely what happened. Of course, Lenin would negotiate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and take Russia out of the war. And it was a treaty that came with a great deal of consequence for Russia. Russia lost a great deal of territory as a result of that treaty. For example, territories like Ukraine, Belarus, these became part of the greater sort of German-Polish area. Of course, these things will increasingly change after Germany is defeated at the end of the First World War. A couple other interesting points in terms of the significance of this moment of time. First of all, it's an interesting fact that there was not a sort of unified perspective on socialism within the Russian revolutionary movement, if you will. There were a number of different groups. You had the socialist revolutionaries, you had social democrats, you had the Mensheviks, of course you had the Bolsheviks. And these different groups actually disagreed quite a bit. And when Lenin began to present during the October Revolution his vision, it actually shocked a lot of the other socialist movements within Russia and beyond. And that's because Lenin, of course, advocated for the creation of a dictatorship of the people, a almost immediate movement to a dictatorship of the people that would then effectively skip the steps in the sort of Marxist idea of historical change, skip the step of, if you will, a democratic socialism on the path towards a functioning communism. And that really shocked a lot of the other socialist movements within Russia and beyond, because most of the socialist movements at the time were actually they thought there would be sort of a coalition between liberals in the state and socialists, and that it would be a democratic governance, and that there would be a sort of long period of time before the country was prepared to become a true communism. And Lenin's assertion that effectively there would be no democracy, shall we say, really shocked a lot of them. And one of the things that shocked socialists in countries abroad was the way it would make the socialist movement look. Because it would make the socialist movement look abroad as though it was this abusive, dictatorial authoritarianism, when in fact that was not the vision of a great many of the socialist movement, who were actually democratic, who wanted a slower transition towards the idea of communism. And so they feared that it would create this idea that socialism was socialism, and that was sort of what Lenin had put forth. And of course, throughout the 20th century, we see in a great many areas of the Western world, that actually was the way that much of the West came to view socialism. They came to view it as sort of consistent with dictatorship and authoritarianism. Another interesting sort of fact of this period of time is that this is a period of time where there's a big question about Russian borderlands. So borderlands meaning the areas of the greater Russian Empire that were populated by non-Russians. And these were areas of the Caucasus Mountains, places like Georgia, for example, where Joseph Stalin, of course, is from, Ukraine, Belarus, for example, the Baltic countries like Latvia and Estonia. This is a big question. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk took Russia out of the war, effectively a lot of those areas like Ukraine fell under the control of the greater German sort of military and empire. Following the defeat of Germany, though, in the war, then there became a big question for Lenin and for the revolution, the Bolshevik revolution, of how it would be that those countries that at that point were really, starting to feel independence, if you will, how those countries could be made part of a greater sort of Soviet state. A Soviet, by the way, refers to a sort of workers' organization that in the lead up to the revolution became a very important vehicle for small-level self-government and revolutionary activity. But back to the countries, how could those countries like Ukraine be brought into the greater Soviet state without sort of it sort of smacking of the Russian Empire, if you will? And of course, ultimately, the way that the Bolsheviks do this is they propose a sort of federal system within which you would have these sort of, I wouldn't say autonomous, but you would have these semi-autonomous Soviet republics. Ukraine, for example. And within that, they would create this larger sort of, if you will, confederation of federated, or I shouldn't say confederation, it's really a federal system of republics, creating the basic groundwork for the heart of the Soviet Union. And likewise, much of the borders of Russia, though not all of them, particularly in the east, in Asia, much of the borders of Russia, of course, are now quite different because, of course, Russia increasingly is, particularly in the West, is increasingly confined to the areas of those of Russian-speaking and Russian ethnicity, particularly, and the areas that are sort of non-Russian, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, areas of the Caucasus region between the Caspian and Black Sea. These areas are increasingly now created with relatively formal boundaries that identify them as part of the greater sort of Russian Soviet federated states, but not part of Russia proper, which would now be the largest and most significant of these Soviet states. So that was a little bit long. Just summarize what you think are the key points of that. I'll give you 2 points this week because that was a little bit long for that. Let's have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see everyone in the discussion forum this week.